Hey there, folks. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Alchemi-Culture podcast. My name is Phoenix Aurelius, and I'm your host. And in fact, I'm not only the host, I'm the only guest tonight. Based on your feedback, you wanted to hear more of just my musings. And so tonight I have chosen to talk about the difference between alchemy and Spagyria. There's this long-standing debate, especially since the days of the early internet Yahoo forums, of are alchemy and Spagyria the same thing? I have many colleagues, many of which are very adept in their laboratory work, who would say that Spagyria is a baser application of simple herbal alchemy and that alchemy itself is much more advanced, that there is a big difference between a spagyric medicine and an alchemical medicine. And for those of you who have watched or listened to the podcast that we did with Daniel Wiseman, this was one of the things that was actually brought up. Both Daniel and I agree that to refer to certain spagyric preparations as somehow being less than alchemical preparations, the way that it's perceived today, especially by certain authors and or other teachers, is absolutely ludicrous. And from my perspective, which is drawing upon historical context and actual sources of the materials, it's entirely wrong. It's not even correct. It's just a perspective that has been perpetuated due to a lack of understanding historical context, or at least that's the best way that I can understand it. So I wanted to go ahead and talk about this. This should be a relatively short episode. Go ahead and sink into your seats and let's just get ready to kind of hash this out. So, alchemy and Spagyria, are they the same thing? Well, first of all, alchemy and that term and that the entire art that we now know as alchemy has existed for thousands of years before the term Spagyria ever existed. Spagyria was actually coined by Paracelsus, coming from two ancient Greek words, spagere and egros. Spagere meaning to separate, agros meaning to recombine. And it's also well known that the major, if alchemy actually only had one motto, so to speak, one theme, that that theme could be summed up by the Latin phrase solve et coagula. Solve meaning to separate or to dissolve, even. That's where our term dissolve actually comes from. Solve, Solve. Et just means and then coagula. Coagula is where our term coagulate comes from, but it means to recombine or to thicken. And so realistically, that's what we're looking at. Alchemy means solve et coagula, or to dissolve and recombine. That's its major theme. And Spagyria means to separate and recombine, which would be spagre and negros. So this is, when we take a look at the etymological root of both of the words and or their themes, they essentially mean the exact same thing. So that's the first case that I would like to make about this. But because alchemy existed before Paracelsus, we have to realize that a lot of what alchemy was before Paracelsus ever existed was largely for the priesthood class, especially in Egypt. And then after that, in the Greek period, or what we would call the Hellenic period of alchemy, a lot of it came to be used primarily for industry, like turning handrails to the color of gold, even though they weren't made from gold. And therefore, palaces and temples and other things could, in a much more cost efficient way, have these sorts of colorings or tingings, or tincturing is technically where we get that term, that are able to change the color of that metal. And these were done more on, like I said, like an industrial type level, and it was less for the development of medicines. By the time alchemy was handed to the uh, Arabic community within the period of about 500 to 900 or so, even 1000 AD, we begin to see that alchemy started to be approached and utilized more as a philosophy of scholasticism, and started to be incorporated more into medical philosophy. So by the time that Paracelsus was around, realistically, he was born in the very late 15th century, but really paraded around and wrote all of his texts during the early 16th century. What we end up seeing is that Paracelsus changed the entire concept of alchemy to really steer away from just the transmutation of metals and what had conceived to be alchemical work before his time and during his time of transmuting baser metals into gold and uh, making baser metals into more precious metals, because it wasn't only gold, like the white stone can make things into silver and so on and so forth. So the idea was to try and stop that transmutation of metal work as being alchemy and to start using alchemy for remedial application. And this essentially became Paracelsus' entire tone. And because Paracelsus advanced alchemy more than anybody since the time of the great Arabic alchemist Al-Jabir, or just known in the West as Geber, Geber, then what we essentially have received now is alchemy as a form of making certain medicines. And so we have to go back to Paracelsus to see if alchemy and Spagyria, in his understanding, were really one and the same, because he's the person who created the term Spagyria. We have to go back to the original context. Now, Paracelsus actually said quite a number of things about alchemy, but one of the most important things that he is quoted as saying is in one of his texts: "Therefore, learn alchemium, otherwise called Spagyria, which teaches you to separate the false from the true." Now, in that phrase, which is widely drawn upon by all sorts of different practitioners in the modern day to say that alchemy and Spagyria are the exact same thing, we have to take a look at the context of that. First of all, Paracelsus was trying to actually use his terminology of Spagyria, which was a newfound term that he came up with and invented, in order to help people understand that really there's a mitigating difference between alchemy and Spagyria. But even more so, the context of this is that he's telling people essentially the exact same thing that needs to be uh, understood about the Emerald Tablet, where it says, "Separate the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity." And he says that this will separate the false from the true. Again, solve et coagula, dissolve and recombine. So in this, or separate and recombine. So this separation of the false from the true, the purification of the false and the purification of the true, and eventually the ultimate recombination of those, would be the entire alchemical process or spagyric process that needs to happen in order to really understand what's going on. And even moreover, he's trying to tell people you have to learn and practice alchemy in order to see what works and what doesn't. If you make a substance that is said to be, have these qualities or whatever, unless you can perfectly make it and show your processes for it, then it is unfortunately false. It's not true. So, in this, he's not necessarily trying to focus on the fact that alchemy and Spagyria are exactly the same thing. He's saying use alchemy and or Spagyria. Alchemy, again, having a more priestly kind of connotation for making things that can alter consciousness and considered to be sacred, especially within the Egyptian context, or making things of an industrial nature more within the Hellenic context, from Spagyria, which is more of the application of, we'd call this the remedial application of the alchemical arts, making remedies using alchemical process and theory. So that's something that's really important. And again, Paracelsus writes so much and in so many different tones that we have to take them all into consideration in order to really get a strong key of what alchemy is and what alchemy isn't. So, another quote that is attributed to Paracelsus, he says that the process is alchemy and its founder is the smith Vulcan. Vulcan, of course, being one of the Roman gods, Greco-Roman gods. Vulcan is a smith and forms, as far as I understand it, the smiths most of the weapons and other things for the gods. Um, you were constantly around the forge and as a blacksmith, and you were constantly using various grades of heat to not only melt, smelt, forge, and temper things, but that same thing, if we were to look at Vulcan as a master of the fire, master of the forge, and we translate that to alchemical works, which basically state that everything, all of the other elements can only be catalyzed by fire. For instance, fire will cause air to rise. Okay, so when you have fire or heat and you apply this to air, hot air rises and it creates a current that creates the force of wind. If you apply this to water, you can actually phase change the water to the point where it boils and evaporates and becomes as buoyant as air and also creates wind. Those bubbles inside of it create pressure and force that causes the steam to essentially move up, or that vapor to move upwards, until such a time where it moves up so far that it's far enough away from the heat that it can condense and then it turns back to liquid. Okay, we can also do the same thing with earth. We can take some quantity of earth and we can actually burn and reduce it down to its basic mineral matrix. There will be a certain quantity of ash, but locked up within that ash is indeed the mineral matrix that just needs to be acted upon and dissolved out by water or some other solvent. So, fire is capable of performing all different states of catalyzation of material, and its heat and light and fire, basically, as its archetype, that alchemy revolves around. So, another way of saying this process is alchemy, its founder is the smith Vulcan. We could just as easily distance that from any sort of mythology and say, the process of alchemy is learning to master various degrees of fire. And that's true whether you're using the wet path or the dry path, but essentially, alchemy and the dry path very much so corresponds to the god Vulcan, or the smith named Vulcan. Yeah, and he also says about Vulcan, alchemy is the office of Vulcan. He is the apothecary and chemist of the medicine. So again, he's basically referring back to the fact that what an apothecary was somebody who was able to provide all of these finished medicines, and chemist was somebody who would essentially compound those medicines so that they could be carried and stocked by the apothecary, so that the end user and or a physician would be able to go to the apothecary in order to supply or provide the medicines for the patient. Um, Paracelsus also says that alchemy during his time has, quote unquote, fallen into contempt and is even considered a thing of the past, though the physician should not be influenced by such judgments. So we can see that even during Paracelsus' time, alchemy had fallen into a state of disrepute because so many people in the West had picked it up and they had become what in the French is essentially they have a wonderful term called le souffleur, and a souffleur is basically, literally translated, it would be a blower or a puffer. It's basically where they are fanning the fires in the laboratory, but especially fanning the fires of their own egos, and trying to get people to buy into or believe things that may or may not actually be true or real. Today, we would refer to a souffleur basically as a snake oil salesman. There were a lot of people claiming that they had secret knowledge of alchemy and could transmute metals and make all of these great substances to help you grow your hair back and do all these other things, only to be proven false. And so, even in Paracelsus' day, they had come to see that alchemy had a very poor reputation indeed. So that was something that he said. And he also said, many have said of alchemy that it's for the making of gold and silver. But for me, such is not the aim, but to consider only what virtue and power may lie in medicines. And this is really important because this is the entire Paracelsian take, was all about medicines. And in fact, he coined the entire process, philosophy, terminology, everything that corresponded to what could now be called historically Paracelsian medicine. And he says in his book, I think it's either in Paramirum or Paragranum, I forget. He says medicine rests upon four pillars, Physic, astronomy, alchemy, and all of these rest upon the last pillar of ethics. So we could go into just that last pillar really, really deeply, talking about ethics and what Paracelsus essentially defined to be proper medicinal ethics, which I tend to agree with greatly. Um, but we really want to focus on alchemy in this episode. So, medicine rests upon four pillars: physic, astronomy, alchemy, and ethics. What this indicates is that Spagyric medicine or Paracelsian medicine actually has alchemy as one of the prerequisites. And most people today would actually state, simply based on the perceptions of authors like Frater Albertus and Jean Dubuis, whom, though I respect greatly, whose traditions have taught me a great deal, whose traditions I myself am a student of and have inherited, I don't agree with them in all ways on all things. And one of the things that I strongly disagree with is that Spagyria is herbal alchemy, which is essentially where that entire concept came from, was that school of thought that Spagyria is herbal alchemy and that it's somehow baser or lesser than the greater alchemical processes that could lead you towards, say, making the philosopher's stone. And the reason I disagree with it is because from its context, its point of origin with Paracelsus, he says that, first of all, the point of alchemy is not to make the philosopher's stone. The point of alchemy is to take all of these sciences that we understand and to be able to make items of vast remedial value or medicinal virtue. And that is the vein of alchemy that I practice the most, because realistically, as interesting as many other applications are, and as much as I may use them or even experiment with them in my own laboratory, the industrial applications, even the priestly or, say, spiritual applications of alchemy, are not nearly as important sociologically, personally, etc., as making medicines are. Everybody is sick spiritually, psychologically, physiologically, and everybody, if they're not sick at this moment, will get sick or has been sick. And for that, various understandings or various remedies and the understanding of how to heal those things are absolutely key and critical. And so, for me, my alchemical practice, my alchemical art is directly in the vein and in the lineage and in the tradition of Paracelsus himself. And this is what I seek to do with my alchemical work. And therefore, I have defined myself by the term that he created as a spagyrist. I practice Spagyria, which is, if I could interpret it, the remedial application of alchemy. We have to distinguish that because there are multiple other forms of alchemy that exist. There is alchemy for the purely for the transmutation of various metals. There's alchemy as a spiritual pathway to help transmute the inner using the outer as meditative diagrams. There is industrial forms of alchemy, just like dominated the Hellenic period. There are uh, more, what I keep referring to it as priestly, and by that I mean like Egyptian priests being able to utilize these various alchemical substances in ways that are able to help summon the gods or to appease the gods or to create altered states of consciousness to peer through into the other world, for instance, and so on and so forth. All of those are more priestly or psychic qualities of it, and I think that they're perfectly valid. So alchemy exists in multiple different forms, but anything that can be made as a consumable that is specifically meant to heal either the psyche, which we would refer to as the mind, or the spirit, or the body of an individual, that is in and of itself called spagyria. We have a very particular term for that, and that is what spagyria actually is. Now, spagyria, far from being reduced to just simple herbal work, actually transcends every single one of the kingdoms. We work in the vegetable kingdom. Okay, we work with water, We work with animal materials, we work with metallic materials, we work with minerals. There is no work within the alchemical corpus that we would just shun as long as its virtues, once it's made, can be applied medicinally. If it has medicinal merit, then it is incorporated into Spagyria. And in fact, we see this with Paracelsus himself, where he makes different preparations of mercury sulfide and is able to take this and apply it to individuals with syphilis in order to heal the syphilis. We're able to see various different applications even of a person's own feces. Okay, so one of the ways that Paracelsus actually cured the plague was to take a pin and stick a pin within the fecal excrement of an individual who was affected by the plague, and then take that little pin drop amount of that fecal matter and drop it into a little piece of bread, roll that bread up into a pill, and have the person swallow it who was afflicted with that illness. And that provided a very sure cure to the plague because the people he treated in such a way were able to get over it. And again, this is through a certain principle of homeopathy in a certain regard, which Samuel Hahnemann was reading Paracelsian texts when he was inspired to create that entire field. So we're able to see that. We're also, and that would be considered an animal excrement material, whereby the body is able to perform the alchemical transmutation of the material and the exaltation of that material in and of itself, where it doesn't need further laboratory rendering. We also see preparations that do require a lot of uh, laboratory preparation, such as in the creation of the Prima Mens Melissae, for instance, where that is one of the herbal preparations that makes its way into the Paracelsian Pharmacopoeia that is said to be highly regenerative and restorative, so much so that it has a whole lot of legend that came from other authors in other time periods who had allegedly made it. Um, and said that it had caused an old woman's hair and and nails to fall out, and that she began menstruating, and that a chicken had lost all of its plumage by taking it, only to uh, not only regrow its plumage brighter and better than ever before, but that the comb on the top of its head also stood straight up instead of sagging over as well. There are other different types of preparations that are very important that use circulata and alkahest and other different materials like this that Paracelsus and Basil Valentine also go over that are absolutely critical to understand for the preparation of higher grade spagyric materials or more effective spagyric materials. So the entire pharmacopoeia actually transcends not just herbal work, but into the animal realm. It transcends into the mineral realm and use of metals, of course. So there's no such thing as historically, except for within the late 20th century, mid to late 20th century, where uh, Spagyria was ever even referred to as herbal alchemy. It's absolute nonsense, for one. But as a result of hearing that and learning that, and without perhaps delving into Paracelsus, and of course, in the modern age, there are some great scholastic um, academicians who have focused very heavily on Paracelsian works and translations. And so within the scholastic or academic communities, there are some people who have also studied Paracelsus, but I am relatively unique in that as an actual alchemical practitioner in the modern day, I have literally delved into Paracelsus as if I were in the academic community in order to really understand and bring to light his philosophies and his practices, and to be able to see what merits those have today. And not only his merits, but the merits of those who came after him, who walked in his footsteps and practiced Paracelsianism and Spagyria, deriving from his methodology and expanding the pharmacopoeia, expanding the tradition, expanding the philosophy, even. And I myself really have a handle on Paracelsus in a way that I don't find many of my contemporaries or many of my colleagues or peers actually have delved into it. In fact, most of them are still working under the assumptions that the alchemical works of Paracelsus, translated by Arthur Edward Waite, are actually good translations and reliable materials, which, let me dispel this right now, they are not. You must read Das Opus Paragranum and Paramium in order to really understand the context of Spagyria, which is as a medicinal art form. Some of those alchemical works by Arthur Edward Waite not only are translated with a particular slant of the translator, in this case, Waite himself, as being neo mystical and having a lot to do with the 19th century occult revival, they completely altered the context from the actual context that Paracelsus was usually writing with, which was, here are the alchemical works that a person should ideally know about. Here are the things that are talked about within the alchemical corpus, which I myself, speaking as Paracelsus, I myself am able to do much better than all of these other yahoos who are writing about it. And that was kind of the take that Paracelsus took during his life. Um, but he also really focuses just on the medicinal aspect. Any of those other texts that were written about alchemy were really written within the context of serving some interest for him to make known what Spagyria is and how these art forms and these practices really fit within Spagyria. Because if you understand alchemy and you understand the transmutation of metals, and if you understand all of this other work that he goes in his alchemical treatises, then you have the prerequisite that is necessary to understand how to make items of remedial virtue as well, which he talks about in rather great detail in some of his later books, especially within his philosophies of medical Spagyria, as it's come to be known, or as Paracelsian, medical Paracelsianism. So realistically, again, there's a couple of important things to remember here. First, Paracelsus himself says that medicine, spagyric medicine in particular, rests upon four pillars: physic, astronomy, alchemy, and ethics. This infers very directly that alchemy is a prerequisite understanding that a person must have if they want to be a spagyrist. Not that Spagyria is the beginning point of alchemy, where you work with herbs and baser, easy materials in order to earn your alchemical wings, so to speak. So that's very important. And also, Paracelsus himself, who created Spagyria, does not really differentiate much between alchemy and Spagyria, except that Spagyria is meant for the remedial application of alchemical work. And again, he tries to say that pretty clearly when he says, "Many have said of alchemy that it is for the making of gold and silver, but for me, such is not the aim, but to consider only what virtue and power may lie in medicines." So, with that being said, are alchemy and Spagyria the same? No, not really, but they can be. For instance, alchemy has multiple different modes of use and reasons why a person might want to study and or practice alchemy. However, Spagyria is the remedial application of alchemy, and alchemy is a prerequisite of studying and understanding Spagyria. So that pretty much concludes my diatribe or my rant here on alchemy and Spagyria. Is probably much more that can be said, but without having other arguments, there's no purpose in hashing those out or trying to get into all of that right now. So if you have any comments or questions, don't hesitate to let us know. We'd absolutely love to answer these things. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then go ahead and leave a comment, and I'd be more than happy to respond as I have a little bit of free time to do so. In the meantime, if you like this episode, please go ahead and like and subscribe, hit the bell notification if you're watching here on YouTube. If not, then go ahead and share this link with your friends or other people that you think might be interested in this work. And go ahead and get the word out about what we're doing here by trying to bring and incorporate alchemy back into our modern culture. Furthermore, if you want to support my work here at the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy, then the best way of doing so is to be able to subscribe to our Spagyrics of the Month Club, where you get 5 new Spagyrics shipped to your door every single month for a flat rate of $75, at least if you're in the US. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to let us know. As always, thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to seeing you soon.